Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this thought-provoking webinar on political rights and economic and social rights in informal economies, a view from Cape Town. My name is Zach Ahmed. I'm a PhD candidate here at Balsile School of International Affairs and a chair for today's session. Before we delve into our discussion, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. At the Balsile School of International Affairs, we recognize the importance of reflecting on our relationship with the land and the ongoing impact on colonization. We acknowledge that Balsile School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldiman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, and we recognize the rights of Atawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples to this land. Our webinar today is part of the MiFOOD project, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Councils of Canada and implemented by the Hungry Cities Partnership. To learn more about this project and other initiatives related to food security and migration, I encourage you to visit our website at hungrycities.net. Now let me introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Graham Young, a lecturer in social and public policy at the University of Glasgow and a former Queen Elizabeth Scholar. Dr. Graham has a rich background, having served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Balsile School of International Affairs and a visiting researcher at the African Center for Cities and at the City of Cape Town. Without further ado, I'll hand over the virtual stage to Dr. Graham, who will guide us through the complexities of political and economic and social rights in Cape Town's informal economies. Please feel free to engage us in the chat and during the Q&A sessions that will follow. Enjoy your webinar. Welcome, Dr. Graham.
Okay, thank you so much, Zach. I will just share my presentation. Okay, I assume everyone can see that. I guess started now. From the beginning. There we go. Okay, well, thanks so much, Zach. And thank you for everyone involved in organizing this. It is great to be here. So as Zach said, my name is Graham Young. I am a lecturer in social and public policy at the University of Glasgow, which is where I am right now. As you can possibly tell, I'm not from Glasgow myself. I am from Canada. I am a former QES scholar, as Zach acknowledged, and I did my postdoctoral work at the Balsile School with the Hungry Cities Partnership, and that involved me spending a year, just about a year, at the University of Cape Town at the African Center for Cities, where I did a lot of the work that this presentation is going to build on. So it was a very great experience. I got to live in Cape Town for a year, this beautiful city that I have this photo of. It's a very, very complex city, a very interesting city, and I wanted to kind of explore some of the questions that I had encountered when I was there in my future research. So I did that from 2018 to 2019, and then in 2019 I finished, and then I came to the University of Glasgow, which is where I still am. I have been doing, I came to Glasgow to work on a project at the time, and this allowed me to continue working on Cape Town, fortunately. So I will say more about that throughout my presentation. So just as Zach said, if anyone does have any questions, please do put them in the chat so we have an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion at the end. And I look forward to any questions you have, any comments you have, anything you'd like to say, whether it's about Cape Town, whether it's about any other context that you're quite familiar with. Because one of the things that I'm particularly interested in relation to informal economies is this question of the relationship between informal economies and institutions. So the broader political, economic processes and structures and organizations that informal economies operate in. So how the way the state is structured, how the way the economy is structured, how those things shape informal economies and how they shape how people act within them. And that gets us into, I think, quite interesting questions of what one might call comparative institutionalism. So seeing how institutional difference, so political and economic differences across different cities, across different parts of a country, perhaps across different countries, and political and economic difference over time are particularly relevant. And I think Cape Town is relevant in both of those senses. As I will discuss, the political and economic context of Cape Town really informs not only the shape of informal economies there, but also the governance of informal economies there. And I think it is particularly interesting to consider this in a context of institutional change. So Cape Town's process of democratization as a part of South Africa's broader process of democratization with the end of apartheid in 1994. So I will we'll just get started here. Okay, so this, as I said, is building off some work that I did in Cape Town. And it came as kind of a puzzle to me, I suppose. When I first went to Cape Town, I had previously done my research in Kampala, in Uganda, which is quite a different context than Cape Town. It is a city that is significantly poorer. It is a city where there are very high levels of extreme poverty. It is a city where there is growing authoritarianism, where so much of how informal economies operate is dictated by questions of political power and political interest, and the processes and institutions that define the politics of the city and the politics of the country. So basically, I was quite interested in this idea that exists within the literature, and that I'll get into in more detail, that democracy facilitates inclusive governance of informal economic activity. So basically, another way of saying that is political rights facilitate economic and social rights. So what that basically means is that if people engage in a form of livelihood, then those people are able to make claims on the government if there are political processes in place that allow them to do so. So essentially, this is the idea that within democratic political systems and democratic political structures and processes, you can exert your power as a voter to try to get the government to have some sort of favorable policy approach to what you're doing. So this is the idea that if you look at a place like Uganda, where you see this process of de-democratization that I've written about, if you see this closing of democratic space, then people lose this ability to have this input on policy, to have this connection to policy. And in South Africa, what you see is the reverse process. What you see is this process of democratization. So I don't want to oversell the argument here. The governance of informal economic activity in Cape Town is very different than it is in a place like Kampala. It is something where there is significantly more support. It is a much more positive in many ways political environment, economic environment, if you operate in the informal economy. However, a lot of my research there was about a lot of the flaws in the governance, and I wanted to understand why this is the case. So basically there's this theoretical idea and this idea that one can observe about the relationship between democracy and inclusion, this relationship between political rights and economic and social rights. And just to question why that relationship, although it exists in Cape Town, why it's perhaps not as strong as it could be. As informal vendors in Cape Town still face exclusion, despite the fact that with democratization, with the end of apartheid, there are full political rights in South Africa, and South Africa has democratized. So why is this the case, essentially? So I kind of came up with a few reasons, one of which I think is particularly pertinent to the MiFOOD project. So one is around this issue of class composition. So what is the nature of inequality within Cape Town? The second is what I'll just call here political structure. So how is politics structures? What is the nature of party politics in the city? And the third is about migration. And that's the one that I think is particularly relevant for MiFOOD, in that I think there's a lot of valuable insights that the MiFOOD project can have here, given the data that exists around migrant vendors in Cape Town's informal economy. So that's essentially the argument that I'll get into in the next 15 or so minutes. Oh, that's not working. Okay, there we go. Okay, so after the argument, I will just say something quite quickly about informal economies, just so we all know what we're talking about here. And then I'll just get into this Cape Town puzzle more, this question of why political inclusion, why political rights have not necessarily facilitated full economic and social rights in the informal economy. Then I will talk about informal economies in democracy in theory and get into some of the theoretical assumptions about this. And then I will go back to these 3 points that I want to make about whether this is how we might consider the Cape Town puzzle. So about class competition or composition, about political structure, and about migration. Then I'll just make some concluding comments, and then we can have our discussion after that. Okay, so basically informal economies are otherwise legal production and exchange outside of state regulatory and revenue apparatus. What does that mean? So essentially it's livelihood activities. It's way in which people make their money, that if they did it under conditions that the state deemed appropriate, that would be legal. So perhaps it is labor that is not taxed, perhaps it is business activity that is not regulated, not registered, whatever it might be. So there are a few things here that I think are just important to highlight quickly. One is that it involves some form of monetary exchange. So you are participating in the monetary economy. This isn't some kind of barter system. The second, which I think is very important to highlight, is that these are legal goods and services. So the goods and services that you're selling are themselves legal, but you're doing it in a way that is not in line with whatever the laws are, whatever the regulations are, whatever the tax rules are. And the third is that it's not just a binary between informal and informal. There is much more, it's much more of a continuum with degrees of compliance. So some people might follow some regulations, pay some taxes, register the business, sometimes in some circumstances, but not in others. And the way that we understand informality often is very binary, and it's often this very class-based understanding. But it's important to recognize that this continuum exists, in that it is something that might exist across a broad kind of class spectrum, as we'll get into. These are just some basic statistics. It's over 3/5 of global employment. These are the best numbers available. They're about 5 years old now. But still, so 61.2% of global employment is informal, so it takes place outside of official legal and regulatory structures. And this is over 85% in Africa. And it's both ubiquitous and in particularly within the global south, it is the dominant form of economic activity. Okay, so just a few quick things about the Cape Town context. So apartheid ended and South Africa democratized in 1994. This led to a new constitution, first in 1993, then reformed in 1996, which led to the granting of a significant list of rights, particularly political and civil rights, but also at least officially economic and social rights. But there was broadly this lack of economic structural change. There is still very widespread inequality in South Africa. In fact, South Africa is still more unequal now than it was at the end of the apartheid periods. There have been significant transformation of governance on informality in this time. So it was very much defined by an apartheid context. That approach has now significantly softened, as I'll discuss in a moment. So the way in which this is governed has changed significantly over time as the political system has changed. So you get this very dramatic institutional change. You get universal suffrage, you get full political and civil rights. You get a change, which I think is quite important that maybe we can get into, is you get a change of the electoral system. So you move from a first past the post system, so the kind of system that Canada has, a very constituent-based representation, to a party-list proportional representation with a mixed member proportional representation in local elections. So you have a party has a list at the national level, and people are elected based on that list, and that is mixed with constituency-based representation at the local level. So in Cape Town, you get quite a dramatic political change. So you get the rise of the ANC, the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party, the party that led the liberation movement, which has been in power since 1994. And you get the rise of an opposition party in Cape Town itself, both locally and nationally, the Democratic Alliance, which is a more kind of classically liberal, maybe center-right-ish kind of party. Okay, you get through this process, you still get relative demographic consistency. You get processes of urbanization, but still very severe spatial segregation in cities in Cape Town and across South Africa. So you still very much see the mark of apartheid on the way that the city is laid out. And you just get very limited socioeconomic change. As I said, there's still very significant social economic inequality that exists within the city. That's very much a legacy of apartheid, that despite democratization, the South African government, the Cape Town government, have not really been able to tackle. And what I'm going to say is kind of fits within that broader context. Okay, so there have been a number of policies around informal economic activity in Cape Town, or that address informal economic activity or shape it. This is something that should have a reference there at the bottom. Okay, so just a list of things. I won't go too much into them now. I'll go into the bottom two later. This is something that I really focused on in my work when I was in Cape Town, and there's a Hungry Cities paper, number 38, that was published in 2020, if you want to look into this further. But just very different understandings of informality in Cape Town in a policy context, which is in many ways very incoherent. Policies are often kind of written down, but rarely implemented. They don't really have popular inputs, and they don't really reflect the desires of people engaged in informal economic activity. So again, that's the paper that I go into the more if you're interested in reading that. It's the Hungry Cities paper on the Hungry Cities website. Okay, and then just conceptually before going into some of the democratic questions. So there are different ways of thinking about economic and social rights in Cape Town. I think there are two quite important ways. One in which reflects policy in Cape Town and in South Africa, and one which maybe reflects a broader international approach that is perhaps more structural. So one is the right to engage in informal work. So if you engage in informal economic activity, then you should have the right to do so. You should have the right to sell things on the street. You should have the right to start up your micro enterprise. And the state should not repress you as they do elsewhere, as they do in places like Kampala, but they should in fact support you in your efforts to do so. This is something that is effectively the city policy in Cape Town. But there are still forms of harassment, as the Hungry City research emphasized quite notably, and particularly harassment of migrants, and very significant exclusion faced by migrants in the Cape Town informal economy. Then there's the second approach, which is more about the structural issues surrounding informality. So it's informality as exclusion from the formal labor market and formal livelihood protection. So you are outside of a formal job, you're outside of a formal social safety net. So this is very much in line with what one might see from the International Labor Organization in Recommendation 204, which is the big policy document on this. So this is thinking about these really significant structural drivers of poverty that again exist within South Africa and labor market exclusion. Okay, so just very quickly, within the literature, there are a few different theories of how we might think about informal economies and development. There's an excellent book by John Cross on Mexico, which talks about different forms of state integration and internal party dynamics. So people in the informal economy can exercise agency, political influence, because of a kind of lack of integration and different incentives that exist within the state. They can make their appeals to the states and get benefits that way. There's an excellent book about India called by Rina Agarwala, which focuses on the importance of pro-poor elections and economic liberalization for people in the informal economy to be able to make their claims. Then there's Alicia Holland's book from 2017, which looks at the importance of political dependence and alternative welfare provisions. So again, just thinking about the significance of democracy, and the significance of political support and the significance of the self-interest of people in political power to allow people in the informal economy to make their claims for greater inclusion. So all of these emphasize institutions, but how do we think about how institutions might maximize inclusion? So I sort of broke this down into all the assumptions that underlie these. So I divided this into three ways. So if we're going to have this connection between democracy and inclusion in the informal economy, then that has these, 10 assumptions that I have here. So that a majority supports inclusion or a minority supporting inclusion forms a key voting group, that institutions translate support for inclusion into representation, that this representation is translated into policy and that these policies are actually implemented, that voters vote based on policy and they make informed policy decisions. They prioritize informality when they vote, and they can meaningfully back alternative candidates. So there's political competition. So if you don't like what someone's doing, you can vote for somebody else. It assumes that politicians prioritize re-election. They can be put under pressure by voters, and that they believe their actions will have electoral consequences. So if they act in certain ways, that might cause a lack of support. They might lose office. That will go against their prioritization of re-election. So the big question, I think, is, do these assumptions hold in Cape Town? Is that the issue here? And effectively, they don't seem to, as I'll get into in a moment. And I think there are a few reasons why, just checking the time quickly. Okay, very good. I think there are 3 reasons why. And I think, again, one is the question of class composition. So the governance of informality is often very much a class project. It is based very much on divisions of development in a city. The informal economy can be a space of accumulation where people can make money. Formal businesses might view it as unfair competition. And there can be very strong disagreements on who and what a city is for. So is a city a place where the poor should have these livelihood opportunities? Is the city a place that is, I don't know, some view of what a global city should be, this great middle-class tourist destination? Is the city a place where there are formal employment opportunities for everybody? So what do people do in a context where there are just inadequate formal employment opportunities, and when those formal employment opportunities are very spatially and racially segregated because of legacies of apartheid? So how does all of this play out in what is a wealthy city with high degrees of spatial segregation? So again, this is not a city like Kampala. This is not like a lot of cities that deal with questions of informality, but it is a city with actually quite a high standard of living, at least among a certain share of the population, and that is that has these dramatic differences based on where you are in the city, where you might live, what opportunities might be available. Also very significantly, how much these laws, how much these regulations might be enforced. So is this something because of the geography of the city, because of the inequality, because of the electoral layout of the city, that laws around informality, rules around informality are enforced in the city center, but not in poorer parts of the city? Is that the kind of compromise that is realized here? And how does this interact with different electoral systems? If we think of these forms of spatial inequality, and if we think of the city having a much more constituent-based form of representation than you would get at the national level, does that create certain pressures? Does it create certain groups of people with common class interests to back certain candidates, whereas that might not exist in other forms of electoral coalition? And then again, if it is so place-based, is that something that is particularly relevant for how we think about electoral system? And again, how do we understand informality in terms of class? Is it something where we can kind of tack it on to an existing class structure? Is it something that itself has an internal class structure? This is where I hope plug the research that I've been doing with the project at the University of Glasgow, the Centre for Sustainable Healthy Learning Cities and Neighborhoods. Cape Town was one of the cities that we did research in, one of the 14 cities across Asia and Africa. And there were a lot of questions in a big survey that we did, the data which is now publicly available. There were a lot of questions around informality and trying to get at these really fundamental class questions, because these are very frequently neglected. So how does informality align with other ways in which we think about class? And how does that align with other ways in which we think about inequality? And therefore, how does all of this tie to these governance questions, these questions of interest, these questions of economic interest, I suppose, these questions of political interest? Okay, and then the second of the 3 reasons is the political structure that exists in the city. So I did a lot of research on the last elections in South Africa, and went through a lot of campaign platforms, looked at some data about voting, and there are very significant differences between the views of the ANC and the DA surrounding informality. The DA very much seems to buy into this, entrepreneurial understanding of informality, where the ANC is much less interested in that. The ANC emphasizes things like job creation, and that doesn't seem to happen in practice. So then you get to questions about the lack of competition. The ANC is quite hegemonic at the national level. The DA is quite hegemonic at the provincial and local level. So even though there is this split within their own little places that they are in charge of, that they are quite firmly entrenched. They have quite different ideological approaches to this, which again explains this difference of how they understand rights in the informal economy, which I think is something that's not often interrogated, not only in South Africa, but more generally. And do they have different voting bases? This is something that is tied to the previous points about class. It is something in South Africa that is very often discussed in terms of race, particularly this view that the ANC gets very strong support from Black South Africans. the Black South African population in a city like Cape Town is quite a bit smaller than it is in other cities in South Africa. So how do we think about the electoral bases of these parties and their specific class-related interests, and how that translates into how we think about informality? And then a few broader questions about voting that exist kind of within the literature. So do people actually even vote for their own interests anyway? Do they actually vote based on these issues? Do they think about informality when they vote? Do they just kind of vote because of partisan reasons? Do they vote because of broader identity reasons? That's an issue that exists kind of within the literature. There's this term that I think I coined, and we'll see about that, I suppose, called electoral stickiness. So if we see processes of partisan realignment, if you see people who are slow to leave the party that they vote for whatever reason, because they have some kind of attachment to it, is that something that you are seeing in South Africa? If you need for this to work out in theory and in practice, if you need people to be willing to vote for other parties, is there just a lack of willingness to do so because they are so used to voting who they want to vote for? There's issues of bundling. So bundling is when you don't actually vote for every issue in a party platform, you just vote for the party in general. So how do people actually feel about informality when they're voting? Then there are issues of asymmetric information, principal agent problems. Are elected representatives doing what they're supposed to do? Are voters getting the information that they need to make these decisions? Is this a democratic exchange that's very much in line with theories of how democratic politics should work? And the last that I just want to make a comment on, and then I'll wrap up with just one more slide, I think, is the issue of migration. So if we are making an assumption about this connection between political rights and economic and social rights, that this really hinges on the ability to vote. So if to exercise your economic and social rights, if to demand inclusion, you need to be able to do so through a democratic process in which you can fully participate. What does that mean for migrants who lack the right to vote? So in South Africa, if you're not a South African citizen, you do not have the right to vote. So what does that mean for the ability of people who are migrants to make these claims on the government, to demand that they are treated differently, to advance their interests in whatever way they seek to? So there are questions in Cape Town and across South Africa, which is itself a very significant destination for migration, particularly from other parts of Africa. The questions around xenophobia, that is a very unfortunate reality of South African politics around migration. Does that shape the way that people respond to not only migrants in the informal economy, but policies about the informal economy more generally, and that sometimes makes its way into the policy landscape? And is this lack of voting rights part of the explanation for the unique challenges that migrants face? So again, this is where the Hungry Cities research comes in quite importantly, because it highlights the experiences of migrants, because there is the ability to contrast the experiences of migrants with the experiences of non-migrants and see where there's a difference here, and perhaps start to explore why this is the case. Is this part of this broader story about why this relationship between political rights and economic and social rights in Cape Town is not as strong as it could be, because the simple ability to participate in politics, and because of the role of migrants in politics, is not what one would need in theory for that to work. So basically, there's a lot of value in the data that we get from the Hungry Cities research, because it allows us to do this, and because it's looking at something like food, because food has this broader structural importance within the economy, within people's livelihoods, both for providing an essential good and/or service, and for providing these employment opportunities. It becomes a really useful way in which we can understand some of these broader questions that I'm trying to sketch out here. Okay, that heading should not say class composition. It's going back to what I outlined about the assumptions about why people vote. So basically, I tried to make a very rough sketch of all the 10 assumptions that I outlined earlier and whether or not they exist in Cape Town. So is there a majority that supports inclusion? Am I minority supporting inclusion that forms a key voting group? Like, maybe, not really. It's hard to know the first part of that. It's hard to know the second part of that. And with these different electoral structures, you have to think about it differently in national and in local terms. Do institutions translate support for inclusion into representation? Not really. Does this go into policy? Not really. Are these policies implemented? Well, no, they're not. At least not in any comprehensive sense. Do voters vote based on policy? That is a very contentious issue, not only in South Africa, but more broadly. There is not a significant amount of evidence that they necessarily do and are willing to change their vote based on these policy concerns they have. And that they prioritize informality when they do. There does not seem to be evidence that this is the case. And there is a kind of limited ability to meaningfully back alternative candidates. This idea that if you have political hegemony of a certain political party, then it is difficult for these alternative, so these forms of electoral incentive, I suppose, to actually play out. So again, politicians certainly do prioritize re-election, but they don't have any reason to believe that their actions will have these electoral consequences. So just very, very importantly, to kind of sum up this argument, is that, of course, democracy matters, democracy is important. It has not only this intrinsic value of individual rights and individual autonomy, but it has a practical value, an instrumental value around improved policy, which again, you can very much see in Cape Town compared to a place like Kampala. But it also really matters about these broader questions of inequality. It really matters what the nature of the politics is that is operating within that democratic system. And it also really matters what some of these questions around migration are in different levels of rights. And if those do not exist fully, then you might get these kind of complications that you see in Cape Town. Then I just have my references here, and I would be happy to share this with anyone who's interested. But I think that is all for now. So I'll just stop sharing, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham, for that intriguing presentation. Now we'll go into the Q&A sessions. As we wait the Q&A, the questions from the audience, I couldn't help but realize that in your exploration of the political rights and economic and social rights in Cape Town's informal economies, you highlighted the exclusion of the informal economy. I come from Nairobi, and drawing a comparative perspective in cities like Nairobi, where approximately 80% of the population rely on in the informal economy, they face similar dynamics, but also there are key differences and commonalities in the challenges that they face by informal workers in Cape Town and Nairobi. So reflecting on your experiences in Cape Town, how do the nuances of political and policy landscape contribute to variations in the realization of economic and social rights within Cape Town's informal economy?
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. That's fascinating. So I'm less familiar with Nairobi itself, but my understanding of it is that there are a lot of parallels with a place like Kampala. That again, the informal economy is essentially the urban economy. It is the source of livelihoods. It is the source of goods. It is the source of services. It is the source of employment. I believe the Nairobi government has aspirations, like many urban governments do, to make the city, appear more orderly, to collect revenue. I would assume all these standards arguments that you hear about informal economies. So I think if we are contrasting a place like that, or a place like Kampala with a place like Cape Town, again, this is where a lot of my initial interest came in, which is the significant institutional differences. So you see this institutional difference across space. So the South African political economy, South African political processes, structures, institutions are just far more democratic. They're far more open, and one can see the effect that has on policy design. So obviously there's a very specific history there with the end of apartheid, and that is something that you can see over time as well. You can see the forms of inclusion, the governance significantly improving as more democratic space opens up. But it is something that, as I said earlier, I don't want to overplay this argument. Like if you compare it to a place like Kampala, certainly if you compare it to a place like Nairobi, you do really see this impact of democratic decision-making processes on policy design. And you see policymakers really genuinely interested in improving policy. You see policymakers really genuinely trying to design forms of support. You see policymakers really trying to balance all these different urban issues, I suppose, that exist around informality, whether it is aesthetics, whether it is, urban order, which is a common term, whether it is something like the desire for revenue, whether it is something like competition from formal businesses. There is just a lot more openness and a lot more ability to pull in those voices and just willingness to engage and genuine desire to engage. Whereas if you are in a context, again, I can't speak to Nairobi specifically, if you're in a context like Kampala, as the democratic space receded, there is essentially no interest in any of that. There is no interest in seeking what people in the informal economy want. There's no interest in trying to constructively come up with policies. It is very much, okay, well, this is illegal now. It was criminalized in Kampala, or street vending was criminalized in Kampala. It is something that the government essentially has a all stick and no carrots approach to, I suppose. So if you think of one of the great questions of informality, which is, how much of this, there's a lot of debate around this point, but how much of this is a cost benefit analysis, essentially? So is it people kind of pulling out of the great social contract? If we think of the social contract of like, okay, well, I will pay my taxes, I will follow the rules, and these are the benefits that I get from the state in return. If you exist in a place like Kampala, where the formal labor market essentially doesn't exist, or it's certainly not sufficient to absorb all the labor that is demanded, or there's all the labor supply. There's very insufficient demand for that labor. And if you don't have the social safety nets, if you don't have very basic services, then what is the social contract that you're understanding in terms of informality? So in South Africa, that social contract exists. And that social contract exists very much as a result of democratic politics. And social contracts essentially always exist as a result of democratic politics. People making claims on the state for things like education, for things like improved healthcare, for things like welfare payments. Like these are all things that came and were very much built up with democratization in South Africa. So you can see this very clear link between democratic states and how they imperfectly try, but they try at least to build these social safety nets and have these broader forms of inclusion. In some parts of the global south, but in others you very much see this opposite approach, and you can seemingly tie that quite strongly to these institutional differences around how political power is structured and how political decisions are made and policy is designed.
Thank you so much. There's a question by Jenjon. He asks question on he has two key questions. One is, could you please elaborate on the social organization community groups of informal workers in Cape Town? Do they play a role here? Given all these barriers, what do you think will be changes needed to enable translation of political rights in the social and economic rights, especially in the context of Cape Town?
Yeah, so what do I think will be needed? So those questions are related. So I actually want to have a bit of a broader scope on this. So just a few broad things. Interest groups are quite active in South Africa, and because they have this political space, because they can make appeals to the because there is this lack of repression or criminalization. There is an ability for people to come together to go to the states to make their demands. I think there are very significant questions around that phenomenon. When it does happen, it's very important to have representation. It's very important to have a voice. This isn't a comment specifically about Cape Town, but it's true about informal economies more generally. There are always very major questions, very important questions that should be asked about the ability of a group that's claiming to represent people in the informal economy to actually represent people in the informal economy. Does it represent a broad sort of collection of interest in the informal economy? Does it in fact represent marginal interest? If you do have vast differences within the informal economy, if you do have things like gender inequality playing out, if you do have things like racial inequality playing out, if you do have things, again, like inequality around migration status playing out, then how much are people who are making claims for representation, how much do they actually represent these things? So that's sort of a response to that. So again, like there's very much an active network of engagement in Cape Town around a very broad range of social policy issues, public policy issues. I think that when you get to the informal economy specifically, because of its kind of quasi-legal nature, you get some people kind of pulling away and maybe not wanting to engage with that. When you do engage, questions of who you actually engage with when you do that are very, very important in policy. So the second question I actually want to answer, again, going a bit beyond Cape Town, just some research that I've done elsewhere, some work that I've done elsewhere. With a colleague that I have in Colombia, we did some work to try to design an inclusive policymaking process that would be working with local governments, local policymakers, and people involved in the informal economy to bring people in the informal economy into the policymaking process. So if we have this principle that we have here in, that I discussed here in the context of Cape Town, that political rights leads to economic and social rights, that inclusive decision-making processes lead to inclusive economies, essentially. Like, okay, well, how can we set up those inclusive decision-making processes? If the problem, as I outlined here, around Cape Town is around, the way in which politics is playing out in these institutions, the way in which there's broader inequality, the way in which, these questions of migration become quite complicated. Can we just set up a decision-making process that is more open, that will allow what is, in honesty, quite a receptive policy-making community in the city to engage in that process as well, and perhaps formulate policy based on that. I think there are significant structural questions around that, about whether it would work. There are, again, very significant structural questions around the politics of migration. Would migrants be included? Would their lack of citizenship be seen as something that prevents them from participating in policymaking? Would it be something that would make them quite hesitant, particularly if their migration status is not formalized itself? Is it something that, if we think about these two ways of understanding rights in the informal economy, as I said, is it something where you actually do need to get to this deeper understanding of rights, or not deeper, that's perhaps loaded, but this broader understanding of rights? So we can have rights for people in the informal economy, but there are also really significant structural issues around access to informal employment, access to good quality public services, that just fundamentally gets at the political economic settlement that exists within South Africa, that came about with the end of apartheid. Can you actually have an inclusive policy around informal economy if you don't tackle structural unemployment, if you don't tackle highly racialized inequality that still exists as a result of apartheid? Why is it that some people can rely on the formal labor market, whereas others can't, and it's informal employment for them? So I think I think perhaps you could have, addressing the immediate needs. So what do people in the informal economy want? Ask them, they'll probably tell you. It might be something about whatever benefits that might come from engagement with the state. And that's, again, something the city of Cape Town is trying to do. It is something that they can perhaps do better, but I think that the opportunity is there for that to develop more. But then there's the broader structural questions that exist within the South African economy that I think make this much more complicated. Again, South Africa is, I believe it's still the world's most unequal country, and that inequality is very much a result of policy decisions, and it's policy decisions in the apartheid era and before, and a kind of failure to address that sufficiently ever since. So I hope that wasn't too pessimistic. I think there was some hope there. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess we have two more questions, but before we come to those questions, quickly, I find that your focus on migrants within informal food economies is intriguing. So, and you raised question of exclusion of the informal workers within the South Africa's economy. So how does the intersectionality factors such as migration, status, gender, ethnicity affect experiences of individuals engaged in the informal activities?
Yeah, very good question. So the gender context I know less about specifically in Cape Town. Informality is often a very highly gendered activity. It is something that is often undertaken by women disproportionately, because it's tied to these broader forms of marginalization, right? So there are very significant questions conceptually to ask about why informality exists. If you view it as a result of labor markets exclusion, if it is something that people can't get jobs. The nature of a lot of forms of informal work is often feminized in many places. So if it is something like selling food at a market, that's often something that's seen as quite feminized. So I think there are very significant gender questions to ask. And I think that point about gender questions really gets back to my earlier points about representation, because if you think about these divisions of activities that exist within the informal economy, are people who claim to speak for the informal economy, are they actually representing these intersectionalities? Are they, is it just a group of the more privileged men that exist in the informal economy who are claiming to speak for everyone? Or is it something that even within the informal economy itself, when claims are made, they're being sensitive to these kinds of things? The migration status, I think, is particularly interesting for a very specific reason, because informality is, like, at its core, there's a lot of disagreement on this, but I think this is true. At its core, it's really a legal status, right? It is your status in relationship to the law. It is your status in relationship to the state. And because as a migrant, your relationship to the law and your relationship to the state is fundamentally different than to a non-migrant. So again, that could be because you are a non-regularized migrant. It could be just as a migrant in your rights to change jobs, your rights, obviously, again, to things like vote, your rights to access social safety nets is just fundamentally different. That varies across contexts. But when you're a migrant in the informal economy, you have this broader form of exclusion that other people perhaps do not have, because you have exclusion as a result of your migration, your migratory status. So if you think of, again, informality as labor market exclusion and perhaps exclusion from social safety nets, that is something that migrants often experience anyway, and that migrants regularly do experience anyway. So if we're thinking about, okay, well, why do people engage in the informal economy? Is a reality of that around migration, just this fact that migrants often have this broader exclusion anyway. That if you come to South Africa from, say, another part of sub-Saharan Africa, you don't have the ability to get a standard job, but you want to build your livelihood somehow. Is the informal economy your only option at that point? And your ability, again, to make claims as a citizen, your ability to rely on rights, your ability to be treated by the state in a certain way, and unfortunately your ability to often be treated by the public because of high levels of xenophobia is just fundamentally different. So I think because of these like really basic legal questions, I think migration status is something that's particularly interesting to think about in the context of informality.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm gonna ask you a question posed by Dr. Cherry Enns. She asks, she's thanking you for your presentation, obviously, and she says, how can your conclusions extend to digital, virtual, and international or global informal activities? Does our understanding of informality and the role of state need to be redefined? I'm thinking of the activities that refugee hosts and youth in Nairobi are part of, and in fact, globally.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. So I think a lot of these come down to sort of changing forms of economic governance. So when we think of informality, again, it's very basically a relationship to some sort of legal regulatory taxation structure. So where that exists in relation to digital economies is perhaps sometimes ambiguous. Digital economies regularly outpace the state in the ways in which they operate and the ways in which they're regulated or not regulated. I think that this is something that in terms of relationship to the state, I think that's a very important fundamental point to hold on to. There's quite a bit of work about informality. I don't want to critique too much of it here, especially with the limited amount of time left. But I think there's a lot of work about informality that really perhaps loses sight of that quite basic fact, that it is something that it is at its core a legal relationship, or it's at its core relationship with the state. So that could be the state in a variety of ways. That could be the state at a local level. That could be the state at a national level. Perhaps if there are certain regulatory regimes, that could be at an international level or a supranational level, but still the the adoption and the implementation of those regulations and those laws and those agreements would be done by a national government, essentially. So a lot of this is very transnational. So you get that very much in the context of migration, whether it is things like remittances, whether it is informal cross-border trade, whether it is just informal flows of goods and services. There's very much that reality. There's very much the reality that borders themselves, because borders set up, laws and rules and regulations, and people, in the context of South Africa, in the context of many other places, the United States, much of the European Union, people try to get around those borders and to try to engage in their livelihood activities when doing so. And then borders create certain economic divisions because of that. There's very much that reality. So I think it's quite important to both recognize that economies are quite global. I think it's also important to recognize that the extent to which we're uniquely globalized historically is maybe a bit overplayed. We can think of previous eras of globalization, particularly kind of early 20th century, maybe late 19th century. And the nature of globalization changes. Maybe it's just the spread of anarcho-capitalism, who knows? But we need to think of how these things are integrated. We need to think of the role of borders within that. But we also need to think, okay, well, this is something that is very much about the state. It's very fundamentally about the state. And that is something I think we really need to hold on to here.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna pose to you a question asked by Professor Jonathan Crash. He asked, do you have any insights into any similarities and differences in how the national and local government exhibited by Butcher's bias what she calls anti-informality bias during pandemic?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. This is something that I think was a broader phenomenon in the pandemic. So basically, the pandemic is something that involved the states imposing quite a lot of regulations, regulations driven by public health. Public health, interestingly, is something that is often used in the context of governing informality. Public health is something that obviously during COVID, governments around the world did a very broad, very long list of things, I suppose, in response to the pandemic. A lot of that had to do with regulations that were perhaps more harshly imposed on people in the informal economy than people elsewhere. And I think this is something that has, it certainly has resonance beyond South Africa. So the project that I mentioned in Colombia, we were doing that during COVID. And a lot of what we found on that, we published that article, Environment and Urbanization. A lot of what we found is the very specific vulnerabilities that existed around informality as a result, or as a result of informality during the pandemic. So people in the informal economy had quite specific vulnerabilities in relation to the informal status. I think that the anti-informality bias is something that is certainly it's quite convincing. It's something that I think some governments, particularly in places like Uganda, took quite cynical advantage of to kind of play politics, whether around distribution, whether around who, where rules are enforced and who has rules enforced on them. I think that is something that perhaps plays into this broader question about institutions and instruction, and certainly about political powers. I think that in terms of whether or not there's a difference between institutional contexts in terms of anti-informality bias, I think that'd be quite an interesting empirical question to explore. I think obviously in a place like South Africa, you certainly do get, or you certainly did see that, but there is still this kind of fundamental floor of rights, and there is still this fundamental floor of democratic accountability, however flawed it might be in practice. There's this floor that it does not fall below. And if you look at, that this is a very low bar in terms of rights and in terms of democracy. If you look at a country like Uganda, if you look at how much the governments took these things into consideration, if you look at how much the government used this extremely cynically to shore up its own power, to do things in advance of upcoming elections, you see the fact that there are very clear differences because of how power structures work. This is not at all to say South Africa did it wonderfully, but if you look at institutional environments that were much more restrictive, I think you can make that kind of connection between what the politics look like and what the outcomes of the policies were.
And I think like the biggest conundrum then is like in cities like Cape Town and in many cities around the world, like in global south especially, is these political elites largely relying on informal workers for their political right, but still viewing informal economy as a site for social and environmental problem. To conclude, how do you think that can be overcome? Like
in the last 2 minutes. Yeah, I suppose I'll just stick to the main theme of this process or this presentation. And I think it's genuinely fundamental to how we understand informal economies. If we think about democratic decision making again in terms of this not only intrinsic value but this instrumental value, if we think democratic decision making leads to better outcomes, then we need to be much more serious about that. And we need to be much more serious about local democracy. We need to be much more serious about getting people involved, and that means people in the informal economy involved in policies surrounding the informal economy. It means that, you know, if there are social concerns and if there are environmental concerns, then there are certainly a lot of social concerns around informal work. Like it's very important to highlight that around basic things like working conditions. That is something that really, you know, needs to be taken seriously. But you can't have these top-down approaches that just seem to fail consistently. You need to get people on board if you want to actually address a problem that solves them, and you need to get them involved in deciding what that looks like, because this is the informal economy. If the informal economy is defined by disengagement and exclusion, then otherwise that disengagement and exclusion is going to continue and nothing's going to get done. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for your intriguing presentation. I really enjoyed it. Especially coming from Global South, that comparative and unpacking many commonalities and differences that seems to appear. And thank you so much for our audiences for joining us from all across the world, and hopefully you join us for our upcoming webinar series as well. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Graham.
Thanks so much, everyone. Just very quickly, I didn't have my email address on my presentation. I am Graham Young 2 at Glasgow. So if you Google me, you can find me. Please feel free to get in touch if you want to continue this conversation. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.